Folks, I need you to sit with this one. The President of the United States is standing in front of cameras telling you America has total control of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran is telling you, in writing, that it's still blocked. Both of those things cannot be true. And when a president says something that isn't backed up by what's actually happening on the water, that's not a talking point. That's a problem. Stay with me. Here's the fact, one sentence. Trump says the US has total control over the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway that a huge share of the world's oil passes through, while Iran says it's still closed, and ship traffic is down roughly 90% from before the war started. Let me say that slower. The president is telling you a fight is over. The other side is telling you it isn't. And the actual ships, the ones that are supposed to be moving oil through that strait right now, are mostly sitting still. 90% fewer ships than before this war began back in February. Translation of the translation. When someone tells you they won, and the evidence out says otherwise, you don't get to just take their word for it. You check the receipts. And right now, the receipts don't match the claim. Now let's do what I was trained to do. Let's treat this like a case, not a headline. You're the jury. I'm walking you through the evidence. Question 1. What does the actual evidence show? Not the statement. The evidence. Iran's Persian Gulf Strait Authority, the body Tehran set up specifically to manage this waterway, posted publicly that the strait remains blocked and will be reopened until Iran's conditions are accepted. That's not a rumor. That's an official statement from the agency that actually controls the checkpoints. Meanwhile, independent shipping data shows traffic at roughly 10% of pre-war levels. You don't get a total control verdict from a jury when the other side's own witness, and the physical evidence, says the opposite. Question 2. Who benefits from saying, we own it? Whether or not it's true. This matters, folks, because words have consequences in a war zone. Total control sounds like the crisis is winding down. If you're an oil trader, total control is supposed to mean supply risk is easing. But here's the problem. Brent crude didn't drop on this claim. It barely moved. The market isn't buying the total control story either, and markets don't lie to be polite. Question 3. Who signed off on the actual escalation happening underneath the rhetoric? While the president was telling reporters, we own it, the US Navy fired on a Panama flagged vessel that was trying to get around the American blockade. Houthi rebels struck another vessel off Yemen's coast that same week, and people died. That's not what control looks like. That's what an active, unresolved shooting war looks like. You don't need to fire on ships passing through water you already fully control. You fire on ships when you're still fighting over who gets to decide what passes through. Question 4. What's the real motive behind the claim? Look at the calendar. The interim agreement from June, the one that gave both sides 60 days to work this out, expires on August 17th. That's days away. An Iranian source told Reuters this week there's nothing to extend, and that no talks are even happening with Washington directly right now, only through Oman as a go-between. When a deadline is closing in and the actual negotiating table is empty, we own it isn't a status update. It's a negotiating position, dressed up as a fact, aimed at looking strong right before a deadline that could blow the whole thing up. Connect the dots. Here's where it's interesting. This isn't the first time in this conflict that the public claim and the private reality have split apart. This war started back in February, when the US and Israel struck Iran. Since then, Trump has swung back and forth, publicly threatening to resume strikes one week, publicly claiming talks are close to a breakthrough the next. That's not a strategy shift. That's a pattern. Confidence in public, uncertainty in private, and the public statement always tilted toward whichever version sounds strongest on camera. Now put total control of Hormuz next to that pattern. Iran's own military advisor told the US outlet this week that the American military is weaker than what we perceived. A direct, public rebuttal aimed at undercutting the very claim Trump is making. Iran's foreign minister went even further, posting that Washington has long miscalculated due to intelligence failures, and said the Hormuz claim is now an even bigger miscalculation. That's not a country that sounds like it's backing down. That's a country calling the American claim a bluff, publicly, in after day. And here's the piece that should really bother you as a juror. Behind the scenes, there's actual diplomatic movement, just not the kind Trump is describing. Iran says it's negotiating with Oman, not the US directly, about a plan to reopen the strait with new shared shipping lanes. Qatar's foreign ministry says it's hearing positive messages from both Tehran and Muscat. Pakistan's interior minister flew to Tehran this week specifically to try to get Iran back to the table under the June agreement. In other words, the real progress, if there is any, is happening through intermediaries quietly, while the loudest public claim is coming from the one person not actually in those rooms with Iran. That's the pattern, folks. When the facts on the ground are messy and uncertain, the public gets the confident version. When you actually follow where the real conversations are happening, it's a different, much less certain story. So let's close this out the way I'd close a case in front of a jury. Total control is not a fact. It's a claim, made by one party in an active war, contradicted by the other party's own official statements, undercut by shipping data showing traffic down 90%, and complicated by the reality that the US Navy is still firing on ships trying to move through those waters. If you actually had total control, you wouldn't need the Navy to open fire to enforce it. This is a president talking to the American public like the fight is basically won, while his own military is still actively fighting for exactly the thing he says is already settled. Those two things cannot both be true, and folks, when they conflict, you don't believe the more comfortable version. You believe the evidence. Here's my read, and I'm not hedging it. This is a negotiating claim wearing the costume of a victory statement, made days before a deadline that could reignite this entire war, aimed at making Washington look like it's holding all the cards while the actual cards, the ships, the checkpoints, the shipping lanes, are still very much in dispute. Watch what happens after August 17th. Watch whether the deadline quietly gets extended, or whether total control turns into another round of strikes. Either way, don't let the confidence of the statement do the work that the evidence hasn't done yet. Stay sharp. Stay skeptical. And don't let anybody tell you a war is over just because someone said so on the way to the podium. I'll see you in the next one.